I have a presentiment that one day this small island will astonish Europe.
This prophecy of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau came true on the 17th of August, 1769. In the Corsican capital, Ajaccio, a child was born who would astonish Europe and the whole world. That child was the second son of Carlo and Laetitia Bonaparte. They named him Napoleon. Napoleon is a true icon. His name, his deeds, his appearance, and even his romantic life have entered the popular consciousness and remained there. Hero or villain, liberator or oppressor, idealist or power-hungry conqueror. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have all contributed to the mystique surrounding him. Every facet of his remarkable life has been scrutinized, analyzed, and in many cases, romanticized.
More books have been written about Napoleon than any other human being. Every generation writes its own version of Napoleon. As Lichtenberg once said, a book is a mirror. And if a monkey looks in, you can't expect an apostle to look out. And what happens is that each generation looks into Napoleon's life as its own mirror and there finds its own image.
Dr. David Chandler some years ago said that Napoleon was a great man, but a great bad man. He's a multifaceted diamond, an undoubted genius, the master of so many skills. He also had a large streak of Darth Vader running down him.
These days, there are some scholars who have gone as far as to make explicit comparisons between Napoleon and Hitler. There was a degree of megalomania, a determination to dominate one's opponents, and an unwillingness to accept any limits. And in all of those cases, it is possible to draw direct comparisons between Napoleon and Hitler.
Unfortunately, particularly in the English-speaking world, a lot of the image of Napoleon is that of someone who was an aggressive warmonger. But the fact of the matter is Napoleon was a very positive force in history. Many of the wars, if not most of the so-called Napoleonic wars, were actually coalitions against Napoleon, various groupings of nations, often bankrolled by England, who were trying to rid Europe of the one true progressive force that it had during those times.
It's very easy to look back and judge him according to the standards that we have today. He is remembered for his military skills and for his legislative skills, but I think people always find reason to be able to qualify those achievements and those skills by the darker side of his character, and I think for that reason he's often referred to as that great bad man.
In 1794, Sergeant Androche Junot, Napoleon's secretary, wrote to his father about his new employer.
He is one of those men whom nature is sparing, and whom she does not throw upon the earth, but with centuries between them.
Few would argue with this description, but his rise to ultimate power was no foregone conclusion. His family, though modestly well-to-do by local standards, held no sway in the larger sphere of French society.
Napoleon's childhood was essentially that of a middle-class family living on a relatively small island of Corsica. Not long before Napoleon's birth, only a year or so before Napoleon's birth, Corsica had been transferred from control of Italy to control of France.
Indeed, had Napoleon been born, years earlier, he would have been a subject of the Republic of Genoa, the people who actually ran Corsica, and thus an Italian.
The real power in Napoleon's early upbringing was his mother, Laetitia. She was a strong woman. She was determined that her children would succeed. And later in life, Napoleon would write about her with not only love, but profound admiration for the will that she exhibited throughout his career.
As a schoolboy, Napoleon had shown great early promise, but still needed the help of an influential patron to make progress.
The person who was instrumental in getting him to France to schooling, because the family had not the money to do it, was the French governor, who was very friendly with Napoleon's mother.
He used his influence to get Napoleon accepted into the military academy at Briand. Briand was the most mediocre of the 10 French academies. Napoleon was mocked for his thick Corsican accent and soon grew homesick.
For a boy of that age, going into a boarding school atmosphere anyway is a traumatic experience. To go into a hostile atmosphere where he was in the minority must have been even worse. The French students laughed at his accent. He had always been a difficult child in the sense that he wished to dominate his surroundings. He was now thrust into a situation where that was extremely difficult. The result was that he withdrew within himself and eventually devoted himself with voracious fervour to his studies.
He soon made a good impression on his superiors, though, particularly the inspector of military schools.
Very regular in his conduct, has always distinguished himself by his interest in mathematics. He has a sound knowledge of history and geography. He is very poor at dancing and drawing. He will make an excellent sailor.
He also began to show early signs of leadership. One story tells how he led his followers in a pitched snowball battle that took an ugly turn when snow-covered rocks were thrown. Napoleon had wanted to join the navy, but his skill at mathematics led his teachers to suggest that his future lay with the artillery, the most prestigious branch of the military. After 5 years at Briand, he graduated at the age of 15 and went on to the École Militaire de Paris. His nomination was signed by King Louis XVI. The École was academically far in advance of Briand. Again, Napoleon felt out of place amongst the snobbish young gentlemen, but it did not stop him graduating with distinction after only 1 year. His achievement in gaining a commission in the artillery should not be underestimated. Few students passed the test for admission, but on 1st September 1785, Napoleon became a lieutenant in the La Feur regiment. His military career proper had begun. At Valence, where the La Feur regiment was stationed, Napoleon spent a year learning the artillery officer's craft, whilst increasing his already formidable knowledge of history. Meanwhile, things were happening in France that would soon influence young Lieutenant Bonaparte's future.
The background of Napoleonic society is in some ways a very static one, in that there is a society in which hierarchy plays an amazing role, by our standards, which is socially very inegalitarian, but also there are signs of change. I mean, it is no accident that people have associated the term Enlightenment with this period, and the notion there is of talent, individual talent, as opposed to lineage, playing a role.
People were beginning to pick the scabs that covered the absolute monarchy and to look underneath. For instance, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings greatly influenced political opinion in France in this period. Also, we have Voltaire and others who were similarly irreverent. Since the War of American Independence, in which France dabbled very actively against the British with a corps under the French general Rochambeau, many of the officers and men returning from America had had first-hand experience of a benevolent, progressive republic.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
The 1780s saw a rise in political turbulence. The first stirrings of the French Revolution could be heard. French society was about to be turned on its head.
As Napoleon is growing up in the 1770s and 1780s, what he witnesses at first hand is the terminal delegitimation of the French monarchy, as those traditional and legal resources of legitimacy which had sustained the French monarchy for more than a millennium fade and crumble.
France before the Revolution was an economic basket case. The budget was terrible. The king was entirely too timid when it came to raising taxes on the one group of people who could really afford to pay them, which was the nobility, and for that matter, the clergy. Most of the taxes were paid by the group of people least able to pay them, which was the third estate, which was the Paris working class or the peasants. But it also included the middle class, the merchants, the lawyers and doctors and other sorts of folks.
The political disquiet brought about by the teachings of Rousseau, Voltaire, and the returning French officers from America had polarized the situation extremely. And the climate was ripe for something to happen.
Though Napoleon couldn't have known at the time, the revolution would provide the perfect springboard for a young man of exceptional ability. For the next few years, Napoleon divided his time between military service in France and long periods of leave back home in Corsica. He had inherited his father's passionate belief in Corsican nationalism. This now developed into a growing sense of solidarity with the revolutionary factions, whose influence was steadily growing. He took an active interest in Corsican politics and longed for the return of the Corsican resistance leader, Pascal Paoli, a man who drew his strength from such classical authors as Livy and Plutarch.
I defy Rome, Sparta, or Thebes to show me 30 years of such patriotism as Corsica can boast.
And he clearly was deeply impressed by Paoli, and that certainly exercised an influence on him. That's a real influence, yes.
I'm quite sure that Napoleon was extremely proud in his early years of his Corsican origin. It was a very proud society, and it still is today, and this didn't wash off him at his early stage.
Several times he went back to Corsica, taking enormous leaves of absence from the military. And he fancied himself a leader, a patriotic leader, trying at one time to ally himself with the leader Paoli, and so on. He wrote a history of Corsica. He never forgot those roots.
I think initially his Corsican fervour was perhaps encouraged by the way that he was treated whilst he was at military school. He was very much the poor boy. He had the Italian accent. He was socially inferior, and quite often his peers wouldn't let him forget that. That, I think, created the chip on his shoulder, and I think he harboured an ambition, and this may well have affected the way that he grew up later to become local boy making good.
It's interesting to note that Napoleon was somebody who was from the outside. He was a Corsican. Interesting parallel there. Stalin from the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus, Hitler, of course, from Austria. Sort of outsiders who nevertheless try and reinvent themselves as patriotic figures who encapsulate the national drive.
In May 1788, Napoleon returned from Corsica and took up a posting at the artillery school at Ajaccio. His Republican sympathies were strengthening rapidly. His reputation as a supporter of the revolution was growing.
He had heard about what had gone on in America, and he was extremely aware of the fact that should the existing structure crumble, something else might come in its place, whereby other people shot to the surface. And even at this early stage, I think Napoleon was so aware of his capabilities compared to other people that he embraced the revolution, the Jacobins, in order to be on the top of the wave when it rolled forward.
Throughout the early part of his career, he showed a talent for impressing influential people. At Ajaccio, he met the second of these.
He made a very positive impression on the commandant of the artillery school, the Lieutenant General Baron de Thuy, and he was influential in Napoleon's career in later life. Already, Napoleon could see the advantages of having the big guys on your side.
On his way up, Napoleon impressed some quite important patrons. I think there's no doubt that that was due essentially to his talent. There was a talent and a drive there that people recognised.
More than one of his teachers wrote, "Watch this person, he will be successful, he will accomplish great things." And they were proven right.
Napoleon's talent blossomed under Dutille's benevolent tutelage. His young protégé continued to impress, and in September 1791, Dutille gave Napoleon permission to return home. Back in Corsica, Napoleon immersed himself completely in Ireland politics. Now a fully fledged Jacobin supporter of the revolution, he tried to win the Corsican people the right of self-government, whilst remaining an officer in the French army. To this end, he displayed great cunning and resourcefulness. He managed to obtain an official appointment as an adjutant major assigned to Corsica. He campaigned for a National Guard to be formed and, with extensive bribery, was elected a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Battalion.
He hoped to become a close associate with his childhood hero, Paoli. But two things happened. Firstly, Paoli didn't want to know because the Bonapartes, that is Napoleon's father, had deserted Paoli after the French conquest of the island. That's the first thing that happened. And the second is that it turns out that as the politics of Corsica developed, Paoli, it turns out to be very much on the right.
Paoli was still rousing up the pro-royalist and anti-French governmental forces. It came to a civil war on the island.
The newly returned Pascal Paoli put his support behind the royalist counter-revolutionaries. Violent riots followed, and Napoleon was obliged to use force against his fellow Corsicans. It made him deeply unpopular and signalled the beginning of the end of his love affair with both Corsica and Paoli. Napoleon returned to France, where he lobbied influential people in the War Ministry to ensure he kept his job in the army. He was rewarded for his efforts with promotion to the rank of captain of the 4th Artillery Regiment. Whilst the future Emperor of France was climbing the ladder of influence, King Louis was fast slipping down it. On 20th of June 1792, a mob attacked the Tuileries, abused the king, and forced him to wear the cap of liberty. Napoleon witnessed Louis's humiliation. The experience made him uneasy.
The king came out of it well, but an incident like this is unconstitutional and a very dangerous example.
Worse was to follow. On 10th of August, the mob returned, sacked the palace, and slaughtered the king's Swiss guard. It was a scene of unspeakable barbarity.
Napoleon witnesses this from a room looking out over the Tuileries Palace, and he's horrified at what he sees. He knows very well as a military person that one good volley from the guard would have dispersed the crowd at relatively small loss, and that would have been the end of it.
The excesses of the mob horrified Napoleon. As he said afterwards, all the king had to do was mount his horse and it would have been over. And from that point on, Napoleon was extremely distrustful of the power of uncontrolled masses of people.
And that fear of the mob will stay with him all the way to the very end. Even when he is leaving on exile, he fears that an angry mob might attack his coach and kill him. At one point, he is in disguise on the way to Elba for fear of an angry mob.
In September 1792, Napoleon yet again got the authorities to grant him leave to go back to Corsica, ostensibly to help his family. In reality, he still harboured political ambitions on the island. By now, relations with his old hero, Paoli, were strained. A split was inevitable. When it came, Napoleon was forced to flee the island with his family in tow, leaving their estates and property behind them. It marked the end of his involvement with his homeland.
To say, as some do, that Napoleon chose France as opposed to choosing Corsica is therefore a slight bending of the truth. He was kicked out in disgrace.
It must have been deeply disillusioning for him. Without a territorial or a locational pole star around which to centre himself. It's similar in a way. One should be careful about drawing too close analogies with Adolf Hitler, but there are certain similarities, and that is one, of course, that Hitler was a German patriot who found himself outside Germany. And the same kind of problem of identity we find in Napoleon.
In June 1793, he returned to France to begin the next stage of his remarkable career. He was still only 23. The revolution had by no means taken control of the whole of France, and a state of virtual civil war existed in many places. For Napoleon, this continued factionalism weakened France and made her more vulnerable to attack from her neighbours at a time when she needed to be united and strong. Napoleon wrote a philosophical essay, Le Souper de Beaucaire, in which he attacked the wrong-headedness of those who fought against the new regime. Instead, he advocated unquestioning support for it and an end to civil conflict.
Advance to the walls of Perpignan to make the Spaniard, who has been puffed up by a little success, dance the carmagnole.
It was a revolutionary writing, basically a discussion taking place over a supper in the village of Beaucaire. And the main protagonist is arguing in favor of France unifying behind the revolution and casting aside these ideas of bringing back the royalist government. Napoleon wrote that, I believe, because that's the way he felt. He wanted a unified France.
And I think in many ways he was right, because at that time the French armies were fighting for the life of the revolution. If they were to lose those revolutionary wars early on, then France probably would have reverted back at a very early stage to an absolute monarchy, or as near to it as possible. And it would have been stifled very early on. And so I think he believed it was everybody's duty.
It was, I think, a genuine reflection of Napoleon's attitude towards republicanism at that point. It was not his political manifesto. It was not Hitler's Mein Kampf. It was not Mao's Little Red Book in any way, shape or form.
Napoleon was a highly intelligent intellectual who read a great deal, read voraciously, and liked to reread texts again and again. He read Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, for example, on several occasions, and Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse. So he's an intellectual, and he likes to put pen to paper, as intellectuals do.
Writing Le Souper de Beaucaire was an astute move on the young captain's part. While it undoubtedly reflected his true feelings, it was exactly the kind of thing that would appeal to France's new revolutionary masters. It certainly appealed to the Republican lawyer, Antonio Cristoforo Salicetti. He was a fellow Corsican who had represented the island in the Estates General in Paris. Like Napoleon, he was a disillusioned supporter of Paoli, no longer welcome in his homeland. He had returned to Paris and become a member of the Convention, the new legislative body of the Republic. His job was to ensure that the officers of the Revolutionary Army were towing the party line.
It was a very hard school, revolutionary warfare. Indeed, a general, for example, was much more likely to be executed by his own side than to be shot by the Habsburgs, by the Austrians. Indeed, if he were fighting the Austrians, the chance of getting killed was remote. But there was a real chance of being killed by one's own side in 1793-4. Generals were being executed left, right and centre. And further down the chain of command, officers of, for example, Major Bonaparte's rank too were being excluded, locked up and so on. So this is a very fluid, very difficult, very dangerous situation.
Salicetti and his colleagues were feared men. Their bad opinion could lead to dismissal or even death. But to find favour was also to find advantage.
Salicetti is one of those interesting people in Napoleon's career. There were a number of people who helped Napoleon rise to power over the years, the Count de Marbeuf, for example, and others. Salicetti is one of the most important. He becomes representative on mission. He is one of the major players in the southern part of France where Napoleon is stationed, and he's also a fellow Corsican, and so there's a tie there, and they get to know each other quite well. And on several occasions, it is Salicetti that gives Napoleon an opportunity to prove himself.
Napoleon once said, when an officer was recommended to him as a man of exemplary skill and courage, he said, "But is he lucky?" Which in a way is a very acute question. Great commanders, great politicians need to be lucky. They need to be the right people in the right place at the right time. And it turned out in 1793 that Napoleon was in the right place at the right time, and helped on by Salicetti. And if he had not been there to give Napoleon, as it were, the first helping hand up into the saddle, then who knows what might have happened.
In 1793, the strategically important port of Toulon gave Napoleon the chance to meet opponents of the revolution head-on. A counter-revolution in the town had led to the citizens admitting the British Navy under Admiral Hood. On 27th of August, they proclaimed the boy Louis XVII as king.
Put yourself in the position of France. Here's Toulon, one of your major cities, a coastal city on the Mediterranean coast, declaring itself under the protection of your dreaded enemy, England, and allowing British soldiers to come in and occupy the town. Well, you're not going to allow that to happen unchallenged. And so, of course, the French has sent an army down there to oust the British from their position.
Had Toulon been held, it would have threatened the French revolutionary position across the entire southern region of France.
Napoleon was dispatched to Toulon as part of an ammunition convoy commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Carteau. On the way, however, he stopped to make some personal calls. Among those he visited was Salicetti.
During the siege of Toulon, 1793, Salicetti was one of the representatives en mission, in other words, political commissars, as they had them in the Russian forces later on, who was with the armed forces at the siege to urge them on to do their best. Napoleon happened to trot along and pass Salicetti's window, so to speak. Salicetti knew his capabilities and was very pleased to give him command of the artillery in the siege.
Napoleon jumped at the chance. Here was the opportunity to show his true mettle against military commanders who had risen through traditional channels, whom he knew to be mediocre.
One of the problems with the Revolutionary Army in those days is that the very best generals tended to be either dead by way of the guillotine or to have left the country. There were still, of course, some very good ones, but there were also some that weren't so good. And those that were down at the Toulon campaign were those that weren't so good.
Carteau was just the sort of military man Napoleon was destined to replace. Conservative and unimaginative, he had little of his energetic new artillery commander's flair or expertise. Carteau and his fellow officers had done nothing more than impose a blockade. Napoleon, by now Major Bonaparte, intended something very different.
Napoleon, I think, was always an opportunist. I don't think he ever conceived for himself a grand strategy. And I'm not even sure that even at the height of his power did he have a coherent plan of what he was going to do with himself, with Europe, with the world. Opportunities arose, he seized them, milked them for all they were worth, and then moved on to the next one. That was his temperament, that was his personality, that's what he did best. And so in 1793, when the opportunity arises to expel the British from the port, he seized that with both hands and made the very most of it.
The problem, of course, though, was, again, he didn't have very good commanders. And while he came up with some excellent ideas, his commanders sort of hemmed and hawed, and they said, oh, this young upstart, you know, we'll sort of ignore him. They couldn't ignore him entirely, though, because he had the political connections. He got the job because of Salicetti and Augustin Robespierre. Napoleon understood also his political power, and he actually wrote to Paris and said, you've given me idiots for generals. Get me some good generals down here who know what they're doing.
His request was granted in the form of a welcome face from the past, General Jean Dutile. Dutile was now elderly and in poor health, and was quite content to let Napoleon have free rein. Carteau had been replaced by General Dugommier, who was nominally in charge of the forces at Toulon. But there was no doubt who was really in control of events. Now, at last, the young man from Corsica could come into his own. Napoleon lost no time in seizing his opportunity. The weak spot in Toulon's defence was Les Guillettes, a fortified promontory between the inner and outer harbours. If it fell, both harbours would become untenable for the defenders. If Napoleon could take Les Guillettes, Toulon would follow. The focus of the promontory's defences was Fort Mulgrave, known to the French as Little Gibraltar. Napoleon took full advantage of the hilly terrain to site new batteries and had soon assembled a formidable array of artillery. He shelled Admiral Hood's ships with great accuracy. Then he brought the guns in close and began a softening up barrage against the fort. The defenders replied with a fusillade from 20 guns and 4 mortars. During the 48-hour exchange of artillery fire, Napoleon had his first brush with death when the wind from a cannonball knocked him off his feet. By 17th December, Napoleon judged his artillery had done its work. He recommended that Dugommier finish off the job with an infantry charge. Dugommier, like Carteau, was a hesitant commander. The charge was half-hearted, and losses were heavy. Napoleon himself then led a second charge with only 2,000, which took them to the walls of the fort. After 2 hours of vicious hand-to-hand fighting and many more casualties, the fort was taken. One of the wounded was Napoleon himself. Never far from the thick of the action, he had been stabbed through the leg by a pike. At first, it was feared that amputation would be necessary. Fortunately, a surgeon offered the second opinion that the wound was not as serious as was first thought.
He couldn't have done what he did in 1793 at Toulon without, of course, military support. He didn't do it all by himself. There was the army, and most important of all, there were the guns for him to use. The revolutionary armies had inherited from the old regime a magnificent artillery, both in terms of its organization and in terms of its ordnance, in terms of its hardware. But it was Napoleon Bonaparte who took those tools, both human and material, in the summer of 1793 and put them to good use.
Napoleon in the siege of Toulon shows the mixture of ability, drive and political positioning which is to help take him right through to supreme power in France.
Here was a remarkable young officer with the potential to do great things for the new republic. General Dugommier, in particular, was impressed.
I have no words to describe Bonaparte's merit. Much technical skill, an equal degree of intelligence, and too much gallantry. There you have a sketch of this rare officer.
At this point in time, there was a great seething in the cauldron of French politics. People came, they were beheaded, they fell into disgrace, and it was anybody's game. So at that point, Napoleon was one of those on the rise. His main concern, of course, was to build on his reputation as the conqueror of Toulon and to make sure that political capital, as much as possible, could be extorted from it.
Well, there were plenty more twists and turns in Napoleon's career to come after Toulon, but one thing it showed was that he was brilliant at exploiting a success and personalising it, making it look as though it was his achievement and his achievement alone. That is something which every charismatic hero has to learn how to do, to make the most of their charisma.
There was a level above which Napoleon would not have risen were it not for the French Revolution. If you look at French generals over the previous century, there'd been people like the Marshal Duc de Richelieu, a member of the Richelieu family, or Marshal Saxe, an illegitimate son of the King of Poland. These were not people born, in the humble backgrounds of Napoleon. So he really gets his opportunity through the revolution. In the revolutionary years, there is a determination to push forward people, however young, and Napoleon is young, who are talented.
In December 1793, Napoleon was given the provisional rank of General of Brigade, receiving his full commission in February 1794. With the help of Augustin Robespierre, the chance for foreign service beckoned. Austria was one of several European monarchies to whom revolutionary France posed an enormous threat if she were to develop expansionist tendencies. A sizable Austrian presence in northern Italy also threatened the new republic. A French army under General Dumerbion was sent to deal with it. His general of artillery was the young Brigadier General Bonaparte, who used the subsequent campaign to impress the authorities still further with his tactical abilities and skill at planning. His new commander was full of the highest praise.
It is to the ability of the General of Artillery that I owe the clever combinations which have secured our success.
The campaign itself proved inconclusive, but Napoleon's progress seemed inexorable. Yet all was not plain sailing. In August 1794, squabbles amongst the new government led to the fall of the hardliners, among them the Robespierre brothers.
Following that, there was a great backlash against anyone that had anything to do with the Robespierres and the Terror. Well, Napoleon, in fact, was good buddies with Augustin Robespierre.
And so he found himself under investigation as a terrorist, as they were called, after the collapse of the Robespierrist regime in the summer of 1794. Indeed, ironically, he finds that it's his old patron Salicetti who is in charge of investigating him.
Salicetti feared that he might also be caught up in this whirlwind. As a precaution, he used the pretext of Napoleon's supposed misappropriation of funds to arrest him.
He defended himself vigorously. He wrote letters to Salicetti and to others, letters to his brothers, saying, how can anyone possibly claim that I am anything but a patriot? If Robespierre, my friend, had turned against France, I personally would have been happy to execute him, and so on. Well, there was nothing to the charges. What Napoleon had been doing was perfectly routine military stuff. And after about a fortnight, he was found innocent and released, maintaining his rank of general.
I think Salicetti's interest lay with Salicetti first and the revolution second, in the same way as Bonaparte did, in the same way as many of the other characters that featured in the revolution were there. I don't think there was any great friendship between Salicetti. If it suited him to have Bonaparte as an ally, he had him as an ally. If it suited him to have him thrown in jail, he had him thrown in jail. And if it suited him to have him released afterwards, so he had him released afterwards.
Had he been in Paris This is one of those interesting little turning points in history. Had Napoleon been assigned to Paris somehow, or been brought to Paris somehow, there's a good chance, I believe, he would have gone to the guillotine, because they were sending people to the guillotine just about like they had been during the Terror.
For the first time in his career, the rising star was under a cloud, and an unsettled period followed. He found himself in debt and forced to accept the financial help of friends. He became depressed.
If this continues, I shall end by not stepping aside when a carriage rushes past.
He also fell foul of the Minister of War, Francois Aubry. Although Napoleon had been cleared of treason, Aubry still distrusted him. He crossed Napoleon off the list of artillery officers and transferred him to an infantry regiment.
Not happy about this, and quite understandably so, he immediately rode into Paris to see the military secretary, as we would call him today, who dealt with the postings. And he looked at Napoleon and said, "You are too young. You should make way for your elders and betters who have deserved the rank."
And Napoleon would say, listen, you know, nothing ages a man faster than the battlefield. You're talking to the hero of Toulon. You're talking to someone who was a soldier. Do not hold my youth against me. Put me into the field where I belong.
Fortunately, Aubry was soon replaced by the Comte de Pontécoulant. Napoleon went to see him and outlined a plan to get rid of the Austrians from Italy. The minister was cautious.
General, your ideas are brilliant and bold, but they need to be examined calmly. Take time and draw me up a report.
Within half an hour, Napoleon had completed it. He was appointed a general staff position at the Bureau Typographique. It was hardly the chosen area of an artillery officer, but it gave Napoleon access to the cream of Parisian society, including the influential salon presided over by his old associate, Paul Barras. More importantly for Napoleon, he was in the right place at the right time.
He found himself in Paris at a time when there was a major royalist resurgence which expressed itself at the ballot box. And the powers that were in Paris were greatly alarmed by this royalist threat. And it was to Napoleon, who happened to be there, that they turned.
Well, the leaders of the convention, including Barras, understood that they needed someone who could defend them. They were not really truly capable of doing it. Barras was made the commander of the defense forces, but he was not a good general, and he knew it. Napoleon, he knew, not only had the military ability to act quickly and decisively, but he also would be willing, if necessary, to fire on French citizens to protect the government. Now, Napoleon understood that this was the conundrum he faced. On the one hand, he was being asked to defend, to save the government of France. On the other hand, to do that, he was going to have to kill French citizens. And he understood that this was a problem and that this could go against him. But here he decided to protect the government directly was to his advantage and to the advantage of France. And so he sent his young Captain Murat off to grab the cannon that were located nearby.
These cannon Napoleon posted very carefully so that when the mob appeared in front of the government buildings, he just blasted them away with his famous whiff of grape shot. This whiff of grape shot took over 200 lives. The aversion he had acquired to mob action when he had seen the king humiliated steeled his reserve, and he was a no-nonsense man. He just stamped all over them.
He had to kill French citizens, but he was the hero of the day. The French government owed him their very survival, and they would reward him quite nicely in the long term.
Barras realized what a hero Napoleon now was, and how potentially dangerous.
Promote this man, or he will promote himself without you.
Napoleon's reward was the command of the Army of the Interior. With the appointment came money, celebrity, and, of course, future opportunity.
Napoleon had proved himself to be absolutely ruthless in the support of the Republican cause. He was prepared to literally go over corpses to achieve the government's aims. He was regarded as a totally faithful and utterly ruthless, reliable army officer with whom the government could do business.
Napoleon is now one of the most popular people in France. He is in demand everywhere. Wherever he goes, people will cheer him. He is invited to participate in the various salons. He is invited to any number of balls. Of course, he is friends with Barras, who was perhaps the most powerful man in France at the time. The two are seen together all the time. Barras is quite the social organizer as well. He's always throwing various parties, and he invites Napoleon to these. And it is at one of these parties, of course, where he meets Barras' mistress of the time, a woman of beauty named Josephine.
Napoleon had truly arrived. He was still only 26. He had packed more into his youthful career than most of his contemporaries would achieve in a lifetime. For anyone else, it would have been a remarkable achievement. For a young man of obscure origins and few social advantages, it was little short of astounding. He wrote to his brother Joseph, confiding his happiness and his hopes for the future.
People are very satisfied with the new constitution, which promises happiness, tranquility, and a long future for France.
But his early promise and rapid rise were to prove only a prelude. The world didn't yet know what an extraordinary force would soon be unleashed upon it. It wouldn't have long to wait. By the age of 26, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen from the obscurity of his Corsican origins to the status of a national hero. He had military genius, coupled with an almost Machiavellian flair for manipulating people and events. In just 16 years, he had risen from military cadet to General of France. Wealthy and charismatic, he was potentially the most powerful force in the land. The boy general would soon find himself in northern Italy, facing an old enemy, Emperor Francis of Austria.
As far as Francis was concerned, French policy in the early years of the revolutionaries threatened not just Habsburg interests of the Austrian ruling dynasty, but also the German princes to the west of the empire, and he was determined to protect them. It's also worth pointing out, though I don't think this was a top factor for Francis, that Marie Antoinette was a member of the Habsburg family.
The central axiom of revolutionary foreign policy was hostility to Austria, and that was personalised in a kind of visceral hatred of Marie Antoinette, which helps to explain why they cut her head off in October 1793. So Napoleon inherits that from the revolution, this instinctive loathing of the Austrians. The French had mobilised an enormous number of men, almost certainly the largest army that Europe had seen, certainly since the Roman Empire. The French have forced the Spanish and the Prussians out of the war, but they've been unable to deal with either the British or with the Austrians.
The Austrians had moved into northern Italy and were threatening to move against France. It was very clear that the powers of Europe were not happy with the French Revolution, and they were not really going to be happy until the Bourbon had been put back onto the throne. So Napoleon still had opportunities for achieving military glory. All he had to do was get himself off to Italy.
His mind, though, was not wholly preoccupied with war. He had fallen in love with a 32-year-old widowed mother of two, Marie-Joseph Rose de Beauharnais, a former mistress of his old friend, Paul Barras. To a woman whose physical charms were already waning, the young hero of the Republic must have seemed the perfect catch. On 9th March 1796, they were married. 2 days after the ceremony, following a wedding night interrupted by Josephine's dog, Fortuné, Napoleon left Paris for Italy. The newly married general was about to embark on the next phase of his glittering career. The campaign in Italy was a twofold affair. In part, it was an attempt to export the ideals of the French Revolution to other parts of Europe. Perhaps, more importantly, it was seen as a means of swelling the depleted coffers of the French government. A war in Italy would give French troops the chance to live off the land on foreign soil and saving France the expense of funding their provisions. At the same time, there would be plenty of scope for plundering. The campaign also had a non-military purpose, to distract the attentions of the French people from food shortages and government mismanagement at home.
In the period prior to Napoleon's first Italian campaign, France was still having serious troubles. He'd saved the government from one royalist uprising, but the fact is there was still a lot of people who were unhappy with the Directory. The Directory was seen as corrupt. It was seen as ineffective, inefficient. The taxation system, in fact, the whole economic system, was still not under control.
The government had repealed the law of the maximum. This law stated that there was only a certain price that could be charged by dealers for commodities such as bread or flour, meat, etc. When they removed the maximum, of course, the good old human instinct of me first, everybody else last, came to the fore and prices shot up.
The strains of war and of war finance and of people being taken away to fight exacerbated what was already a situation of great political instability. It was very important for France's generals to win battles. The more that they won battles, it would not only, as it were, create prestige for the regime, but also a sense that it was successful and that therefore it was unwise to oppose it. So that foreign victory was important for internal stability.
Equally, there was a good reason for the French civilian regime in Paris to keep the armies outside France, maintained at other people's expense, at the expense of the Belgians, of the Dutch, of the Germans and of the Italians. Because if they came home, hungry, looking for jobs, looking for homes fit for heroes, then the regime might well find themselves with a problem on their hands they couldn't handle.
Napoleon inherited 37,000 badly equipped and demoralized troops. He gained their trust and respect by presenting himself to them as a soldier.
I am a soldier because that is the special faculty I was born with. That is my life, my habit. I have commanded wherever I have been. I commanded when 23 years old at the siege of Toulon. I commanded in Paris. I carried the soldiers of the army of Italy with me as soon as I appeared among them. I was born that way.
The Army of Italy was very much one which Napoleon pushed forward. I mean, he had inherited a force which had been slightly bedraggled, to put it mildly, short of supplies from the previous campaigns, and also not the key force that was supported at that stage by the revolutionary government. They put much more resources into campaigning north of the Alps. So in many senses, Napoleon reformulated his army and drove it forward. He planned the strategy, he planned the tactics. In his early days, he, in a sense, was his own staff.
Unlike his British counterparts, Napoleon could identify with his troops and went out of his way to make them aware of the fact. He knew how to win the hearts and minds of those under his command. Rhetoric, with the promise of reward, was a good place to start.
You are hungry and ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage are admirable, but they procure you no glory. No fame shines upon you. I want to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will lie in your power. You will find there honour, glory and riches.
This was just what the demoralized army of Italy needed to hear. To help him in the Italian campaign, Napoleon gathered around him hugely talented senior officers. One of the benefits of the revolution in France had been the democratization of the professions. Men of merit, whatever their origins, could rise to the top.
1796, after 4 years of wild and bloody conflict on all of France's borders, the commanders in the French army at all levels had elbowed, fought and dared their way up through the ranks to the positions that they now occupied. They may have had the morals of organ grinders and the manners of their monkeys, and they frequently did, but they were a military meritocracy. They were the right men at the right time. It was a star-studded cast, and we can go to any one of 30 or 40 examples, and you can see what sort of potential these guys had.
The campaign in Italy in 1796 shows what a commander of genius can do to sway a campaign, to change the course of a war. Because according to the grand strategy of the Directory, the army of Italy that Napoleon commanded in 1796 was something of a sideshow. The two main thrusts were coming north of the Alps from the Rhénanie-Moselle and the Sambre-Meuse. But it's Napoleon, through his relentless energy, his seizure of the opportunity, his skill, and again it has to be said, his luck, turns what was intended to be a backwater into the major theatre.
Napoleon swept through northern Italy in what was probably the most masterful campaign of his career. The Austrians and their Sardinian allies were beaten in a series of early victories, in which Napoleon made repeated use of a tactic which would serve him well in the future. He concentrated his forces for a decisive blow against the enemy's centre. By the end of April 1796, the Sardinians had had enough and made peace with the armistice of Cherasco. The Battle of Lodi, fought the following month, proved somewhat indecisive.
Napoleon comes to the river Adda at Lodi and finds this long, narrow bridge with an Austrian force at the other end of it. To cut a long story short, the bridge is successfully stormed. And it has to be said that the French soldiers involved, including senior commanders, showed very great heroism, gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty in driving the Austrians out.
I think at the time Lodi was not perceived as being any great victory or battle in its own right. Indeed, it wasn't a great victory. It failed to achieve the objective, which was to destroy the Austrian army. The Austrian army managed to get away. What Lodi represented was the furthest advance in the first stage of the 1796 campaign.
If you look at Lodi strictly from a military point of view, it was a relatively minor action. It was, after all, an action across a bridge against an Austrian rear guard. It was successful, but it didn't have a huge military impact. But the impact it had on Napoleon was tremendous, for a variety of reasons. It was at Lodi where Napoleon himself went down and set the cannon into position. A job normally done by a corporal, and so his soldiers began to call him the little corporal. It was at Lodi that Napoleon gave some fiery speeches and personally directed the advance across the bridge. And he wrote later on that it was only at Lodi that he began to see himself as being capable of achieving great things.
After it was over and they'd broken the Austrian position on the far bank and captured most of the artillery, in the aftermath of that action, Napoleon felt that if he could do that, he could do anything.
I think Lodi is an important part in the painting of the Napoleonic legend by Napoleon. It was when he, in his own mind, thought that he was something other than just a mere general.
Lodi also did wonders for the confidence of his troops. After a string of victories, the army of Italy began to believe that they were commanded by a general who was invincible.
Napoleon personifies the charisma of the charismatic hero. It wasn't just the self-confidence which he possessed himself, which led him to order engagements like the attack on the bridge at Lodi. It was the confidence which he could inspire in others, that what he was asking, which to a normal human being would seem impossible, was possible because he commanded it and he was involved in it. He had the ability to inspire his subordinate commanders and indeed the rank and file to feats which they would not have been capable of under any other commander. And so Wellington says, what was it, Napoleon was worth 40,000 men on the field of battle. And I think he was. The bridge at Lodi is a brilliant example of that capacity of a truly charismatic leader to enable ordinary people to achieve extraordinary exploits.
Within weeks, the Austrians had been driven from Lombardy, and part of the French army settled down to begin a lengthy siege of the city of Mantua. For Napoleon, the way to Milan was now open.
The tricolour flies over Milan, Pavia, Como, and all the towns of Lombardy.
A bitter personal blow soon followed. The directors of the Republic wrote to Napoleon. From now on, he would have to share command of the army of Italy with General Francois Kellerman. Napoleon was deeply aggrieved.
To give Kellerman and myself joint command in Italy would mean ruining everything. I can't agree to serve with a man who believes himself to be the best general in Europe. And, in any case, I'm sure that one bad general is better than two good ones. War, like government, is a question of tact.
Fearing Napoleon might resign, the directors relented.
Napoleon actively propagated an image of himself through friends back in Paris, through the print media, which had developed enormously under the revolutionary era, as the great general, the successful general, a great hero. And there was an emphasis on a mixture of skill and heroism, and a determined attempt to win, as it were, the propaganda war that was very important. Now, in this, Napoleon was not alone. It's fair to say that by the late 1790s, pretty well all the generals, of the leading generals of the revolutionary armies, were in some respects political generals. They had to be. They had to be linked to factions in Paris, not least in order to ensure their continued position and in order to ensure a measure of support, supplies, a measure of reinforcements. All of them were trying to propagate a favourable impression. Napoleon, though, was particularly good at this, and to a certain extent this enabled him to push what became eventually a personal foreign policy.
He was the first military commander, I believe, to create his own newspaper, the Courier of Italy. And so he was, and that was distributed, of course, widely among the army, and indeed was sent back to prime public opinion back in France. We're now talking about 1796. He's acting as a political general already. He's very careful that his men should see the progress of the campaign and place it in a wider strategical context in the way in which he wanted them to.
There was, of course, in Italy, as there had been in many of the German states, a fairly widely spread benevolent attitude towards republicanism. In northern Italy, this was a similar position. And when Napoleon initially arrived and took over, the Italians greeted him with open arms. They were fairly weary of the Austrian yoke, as some of them saw it, and were ready for change. Change they got, because in Napoleon's knapsack was an order from the government saying, strip the place bare and send it back to France.
His armies were unleashed on their cities in an orgy of plundering. food, drink and clothing was seized to satisfy the troops' immediate needs. They also seized gold and other valuables. Booty to the value of 40 million francs found its way back to Paris.
For the great majority, the overwhelming majority of the Italian people, the French army came in 1796 not as liberators, but as conquerors, and above all, as exploiters in one way or another. There were various forms of exploitation. There was official exploitation, as it were, organized by the army commissars in the form of requisitions and looting and the conscription of forced labor. And then there was, as it were, freelance, unofficial exploitation on the part of the common soldiers and indeed their officers in the form simply of pillaging and looting and rape and murder and all the other horrors of war. This was an army which arrived with nothing, and yet it erupted into one of the richest parts of Europe.
In a very short time, there were many outbursts of civil unrest against the French occupation. This was put down by force. Once again, we have our friend of the revolutionary governments coming forward with the sword to flatten opposition.
There were obviously some people who threw in their lot with the revolution. There were indeed some radicals for whom revolutionary France was the power that they looked to. But it's fair to say that among the bulk of the populace, the French at that stage were bitterly unpopular.
For the first time in years, the army could be properly paid. The little corporal standing in the eyes of his men rose still further. There were no lengths to which their loyalty would not stretch. But Napoleon had made many enemies. The government knew their commander in Italy was not a man to be crossed lightly, as he had shown over the business with General Kellerman. Pleased though they were with the tide of booty that flooded back to Paris, they could not have ignored the future threat posed by a popular and successful general with a loyal, well-paid army at his back.
The government recognized that suddenly there was a legion out there that was more devoted to its commander than it was to the government, because the government had never paid them, but Napoleon paid them. The government didn't let them get away with murder as he did. They were his.
Because he's so successful, because he's so popular, he's also potentially dangerous. And in that government's lack of stability, any strong force could challenge that government for power. And there was a great concern that Napoleon might well do that.
As the campaign developed, Napoleon began to show very alarming signs of political independence. Napoleon begins to act more and more not as a general, but as his own foreign minister, as his own Chancellor of the Exchequer, as it were, a government on the move, as a peripatetic government. And so he negotiates with the Pope, with the King of Naples, and so on and so forth, with various Italian principalities, without referring back to Paris for permission to do so.
Soon, the Austrians, under General Wurmser, began a counter-attack. Their main objective was to relieve the besieged garrison at Mantua. But in battle after battle, Wurmser proved a poor match for the little corporal and a French army brimming with confidence. On 15th September, Wurmser, with the French at his heels, broke through the ranks of the besiegers and entered Mantua. At first, it seemed a saviour had arrived.
The net effect was that Wurmser and his 14,000 men, including a fair amount of cavalry, unable to defeat the blockading force, were forced into the fortress, thus doubling the garrison. Therefore, the rations and supplies, which had been calculated to last, shall we say, 6 months quite adequately, would now last only 3.
For months, Wurmser and 20,000 Austrians holed up in Mantua, living on horseflesh. In January 1797, 28,000 Austrians under General Alvinzi and 17,000 men commanded by General Provera set out to relieve the city. Napoleon had only 20,000 men to pit against them. Forewarned of their approach, Napoleon sent 10,000 men under Barthélemy Joubert to Rivoli, a plateau on which he could range his artillery against the advancing enemy. At dawn, on 14th of January, Napoleon attacked the guns and cavalry under the command of General Quasdanovich. The move almost failed. as Kwasdanovic turned Napoleon's left flank. Only the timely arrival of Massena after a 20-mile all-night march reversed events. Together, Napoleon and Massena broke Kwasdanovic's corps and another, whilst General Rey took care of a third corps under General Lusignan. The Austrians retreated, leaving 8,000 dead, wounded or captured. Marching a day and a half non-stop, Napoleon and Massena advanced on Mantua. Provera's 17,000 troops were routed and most were taken prisoner. Alvinzi also suffered heavy losses. On 2nd February, Wormser surrendered Mantua and its garrison of 18,000.
What differentiated Napoleon's approach to warfare in Italy in 1796 from that of his subordinate commanders, those who had previously commanded the army of Italy, and, most important of all, his enemies, was the speed with which he thought and the speed with which he made his men move and act, and the aggression which he built into the culture of the army of Italy, driving them on, making them move faster, think faster than his enemies. I think it was almost an instinctive skill to see what's happening, to feed into an equation all the various problems and to see where the weak link was and where to press at it. And Napoleon showed again and again during that campaign in 1796 in Italy that he was thinking 10 times faster than his enemies.
Northern Italy, though stripped bare by its liberators, was finally free. Napoleon now proceeded to establish a series of new Italian republics. He had no actual brief to do this, but could argue that he was fulfilling his orders by exporting the ideals of the French Revolution.
He set up two republics, the Cisalpine and Cispadine. He wrote largely on his own the constitutions for these two states, and he appointed all the officials. He was beginning to get to like playing with the clay of the world and forming it into his own images.
If you go to the Museum of the Risorgimento in Milan, you will see several rooms dedicated to Napoleon as the first of those forces who led to the unification of Italy. He put the government of northern Italy into Italian hands. And so I would say his image among Italians and his legacy among Italians is really quite positive.
Napoleon's military adventures in Italy had been wildly successful. He had enriched the nation, won the loyalty of his troops, and lived in Milan like the emperor he would one day become. In December 1797, Napoleon returned to Paris in triumph. Although he had brought glory and wealth to France, his return was unsettling for a weak government that had every reason to worry about the presence of a hugely popular and ambitious general with time on his hands. The Directory decided he needed a project to occupy his great gifts, but distract him from any political ambitions. The project they chose was the invasion of England, and Napoleon was given the role of planner-in-chief.
Napoleon saw Britain as the key power that had built up opposition to France in the 1790s. Britain, after all, had subsidised France's opponents on the continent. Britain was the leading commercial and maritime and oceanic power in the world, the power best placed through its control over international trade to finance opposition. And the British government under William Pitt the Younger was a determined opponent.
The constancy of the British government at this time has to be applauded. They were iron hard. Napoleon recognised that until he could get across the Channel, that little spit of water, and land an army large enough to conquer the place, there was going to be no peace.
The war, in many ways, was doing the British a great deal of good. It had allowed them to mop up Dutch and French colonies in the West Indies, at the Cape of Good Hope, in the Indian Ocean, India itself. The British ruled the seas in a way which they had never done before, so why should they hurry to come to terms? So ultimately, if the French were to secure the gains they'd made between 1792 and 1796, they would have to come to terms with the British.
If peace could not be achieved by negotiation, then perhaps there has to be some kind of military action. And the most obvious military action, of course, would be to invade across the English Channel.
His plan, conceived with the aid of the Irish rebel leader Wolfe Tone, involved a fleet of 65 purpose-built gunboats and 250 fishing boats, which together would carry 24,750 men.
In 1797-98, however, the prospect of a French invasion of Britain was dramatically lessened by a series of British naval victories. In 1797, British squadrons defeated both the Dutch and the Spanish fleets at Camperdown and Cape St. Vincent, and the French had been relying in part on their allied naval strength in order to cover any invasion. Quite clearly, any invasion of Britain which could not guarantee control over the sea would be astonishingly vulnerable.
He very quickly realised, as he saw the Royal Navy three-deckers cruising up and down the Channel, that his gunboats and his fishing boats were going to be blown out of the water as soon as he set foot on the water, so to speak. And after studying the problem for some time and realising that he could not, with the French fleet in its existing state, achieve supremacy on the Channel for more than about 2 seconds, he advised the government against it.
However hard we try, we will not achieve naval supremacy in a few years. To undertake an invasion of England without being masters of the sea would be the boldest and most dangerous operation ever carried out.
With the invasion of England ruled out for the foreseeable future, it was left to Charles Talleyrand, the new foreign minister, to propose an alternative. His suggestion appealed greatly to Napoleon: the conquest of Egypt.
The British control of Egypt gave them the opportunity to get to India and their trade routes and so on, and gave them greater control of the Mediterranean. If the French could take Malta, which was a very strategically located island in the Mediterranean, and throw the British out of Egypt, then it would be possible to pretty much end England's ability to control the Mediterranean and do great damage to her economically as well.
You could point out that pre-revolutionary French governments had been interested in Egypt, or one could go for a more cynical and Machiavellian interpretation and argue that essentially Napoleon wished to keep control of his army, that the easiest way to keep control of his army was to take it somewhere and engage in operations that might also build up his own personal reputation. I think both of those are true, but I think there is a third factor which, in a sense, is almost more important, and that is Napoleon's absorption with himself.
It has been called his Oriental complex. Some have seen it as the desire to emulate his idol, Alexander the Great.
I'm sure that he was aware of the parallels that would be brought to bear if he were to go to Egypt and be successful against the British. Not only would he strike a blow against the British where he could, that is to say on land, but, as he said to one or two of his associates, just think, then there's India, where Alexander had been. So certainly the parallel was there.
Napoleon was always keen to use historical parallels. He had a taste for using high-flown rhetoric about what he was doing, and certainly he liked to talk about great conquerors of the past, Alexander and Tamburlaine and so on and so forth. Whether that really influenced what he did in 1798, I very much doubt.
Egypt was also a very fascinating and mysterious country to the Western world in those days. We didn't have Egyptology like we do today. You didn't have tourists routinely going and seeing the pyramids of Giza and so on. In fact, when Napoleon took his soldiers, he also brought with him a small army of scientists and engineers and artists.
Their primary purpose was to study and record Egypt's wealth of historical and cultural data. Naturally, their work would reflect well on the little corporal who had brought them there. At 3 a.m. on the night of 30th of June, with 55,000 men in squally weather at Marabat, 8 miles from Alexandria, Napoleon reviewed his troops and marched on Egypt's second city. The French were in luck. One of the gates of the city had been left open. By lunchtime, Napoleon had taken the city with only 200 of his men wounded. Leaving Alexandria in the capable hands of Jean-Baptiste Kléber, Napoleon turned south and began the long and terrible march to Cairo.
I saw soldiers dying in the sand from lack of water and food. The intense heat had forced them to abandon their booty, and many others, tired of suffering, simply blew their brains out.
The French hadn't really thought through what the Egyptian invasion would entail. The French had not sent a land force to North Africa since the Crusades. Napoleon was well aware that in terms of firepower, his army was likely to beat any force that the Mamluk rulers of Egypt could deploy against it. But in terms of infrastructure, he was dependent on the resources that he could gain there.
So the march to Cairo was a disaster. They had extreme heat and not nearly enough drinkable water. Men went crazy. Men died of thirst. Men committed suicide. It was not a pretty sight. And when they finally did get to the Nile, many of them drank far too much water too quickly and also got sick.
After 2 weeks, they found themselves in the shadow of the Great Pyramids at Giza, facing a combined army of Turks and Egyptians 24,000 strong. Napoleon drew up 2 divisions of infantry in hollow squares 6 deep, with guns at the angles. He kept a 3rd division in reserve. Before the battle, he sought to inspire his men.
Soldiers, from the height of those pyramids, 40 centuries looked down on you.
The elite of the Turkish-Egyptian army were 8,000 Mamelukes, men whose whole lives and wealth were dedicated to fighting. Their leader was Murad Bey, a man who could behead an ox with a single blow of his scimitar. At his signal, the Mamelukes charged the French squares. As they reached them, Napoleon swept in from the rear with the reserve division, cutting the Mamelukes off from their main army. He then ordered his artillery to open fire. The 16,000 Egyptians, who had never seen heavy guns, panicked and fled.
We see here a discrepancy of military technology and organisation, and although the enemy fought with conspicuous gallantry and indeed tenacity, the French had little difficulty in dealing with them.
The Battle of the Pyramids lasted just 2 hours, but secured Lower Egypt for the French with the loss of only 200 men. Napoleon marched triumphantly on to Cairo. Bad news awaited him. A British fleet under Horatio Nelson had surprised the French in the Bay of Aboukir. 13 out of 17 French warships had been destroyed.
It was one of the most decisive, annihilating battles in all of naval history. A wonderful example of all the qualities that Napoleon showed on land were displayed by Nelson in a maritime capacity, in command at sea. Daring, enterprise, energy, wonderfully motivated subordinates, and it led to a catastrophic defeat on the part of the French. And as a result, from that time on, Napoleon was trapped in Egypt.
The campaign ground on, but by March 1799, Egypt was under Napoleon's control. The Egyptians named their new leader Sultan el-Kabir. Napoleon now turned towards Syria. Intelligence had reached him that the Turks were planning to mount a twofold attack, via sea from Rhodes, aided by the British, and on land via Palestine and Sinai. Napoleon's plan was to meet and promptly defeat the land army in Syria. Then he would deal with the seaborne threat.
The invasion of Palestine, and then after that the French forces actually moved on into Syria, but the invasion of Palestine was characterised by a number of episodes which can leave you with very different impressions of Napoleon. There was the massacre of over 1,000 Turkish prisoners in Gaza, which suggests a degree of cruelty and hostility towards particularly non-Europeans, of which there are other signs in Napoleonic rule. I mean, his treatment of the black West Indians of Haiti in an attempt to reconquer those was a good example of his fundamental ambivalence about non-Europeans.
He could do pretty well anything, and no one would find out about it. Or if they found out about it, they'd find out through a carefully edited version which he was providing. And it was the interests of him, and indeed all around him, to put the best possible gloss on what we would regard as today as completely unacceptable atrocities. I don't think anyone will ever know the truth, the whole truth, of what actually happened at Gaza. The best account, I think, suggests that it was, in a way, an act of compassion on their part to slaughter the prisoners, in that there were no supplies, there was no water for them. They would have died anyway. That's one possible way of looking at it. I think the fact is that so many layers of myth and counter-myth have been piled onto it that we shall never know what really happened.
There's also the very famous visit to sick and wounded people in Jaffa, and which was, much painted, and that presented an image of Napoleon as almost a kind of sort of Christ-like redeemer figure, and it was designed to complement the idea of him being a great warrior.
And this, I think, quite rightly, as it has been pointed out, this is a miracle-working gesture. He's presenting himself as someone who is so special that he can heal wounds. It's a healing gesture as well as a compassionate gesture.
The French army enjoyed rapid, if hard-won, success in Syria before reaching the city of Acre. The garrison there was defended by the Turks with 250 guns and 800 English sailors under Sidney Smith. Napoleon decided to try and capture it. He had only 12 guns. Ammunition was so scarce, he had to scavenge for spent enemy cannonballs to use. 3 times the French breached the castle walls. 3 times they were driven back. 9 more guns arrived by sea. But still the French could not get a foothold in Acre. On 7th of May, 30 Anglo-Turkish ships arrived with reinforcements. Napoleon cursed his men, calling them effeminate, but it was no use. He reluctantly abandoned the siege and returned to Egypt.
The image of Napoleon is that this was a total failure, and certainly there was a failure at the siege of Acre. But the reality is he stopped the invasion. He prevented the Turks from moving further south and on into Egypt, and he at least temporarily solidified his position, which allowed him to return to Egypt in time to defeat the second Turkish invasion, which came by sea.
On 25th of July, Napoleon, with 8,000 men, met a Turkish force of 9,000 at Apukir. His first offensive drove the Turks back to Mount Vizier. Murat received a bullet from a pistol in his lower jaw, but fought on bravely. After the battle, he could even turn it into a joke.
Tell all the young ladies that even if Murat has lost some of his good looks, they won't find that he has lost any of his bravery in the war of love.
Napoleon's victory was decisive. 5,000 Turks were drowned, some 2,000 were killed on the battlefield, and 2,000 were captured.
No amount of success on land was going to compensate for the fact that he was now isolated. Egypt had not proved a staging point on the way to India. Never would have been. There was no French fleet in the Red Sea. There was no particular way in which the grand plans that he entertained, at least in his imagination, could have been furthered. Equally, he was now vulnerable and he was distant from the centre of political development in Paris.
So it was time to go. There was nothing left for him in Egypt. On the other hand, back in France, with the war resuming at the end of 1798 and going very badly indeed for the revolution, for the Republican government in the early months of 1799, there was clearly work for him to do there. And that's why he went back.
Once safely back on French soil, Napoleon received the hero's welcome that was becoming almost customary. Many already saw Napoleon as a potential leader of France, but even with popular and military support, he could not risk overplaying his hand. The weakness at the center of French politics had created a complex web of factions, each with its own agenda. These did not necessarily include Napoleon. But events were moving in his favor. Emmanuel Joseph Thiers, the man who had betrayed Robespierre, was now the most influential member of the Directory. With another member, Roger Ducos, he planned a coup. But he needed someone with military nous and muscle to complete the triumvirate.
It has been argued, could be argued, perhaps should be argued, that it was only a matter of time before a general arrived to restore order in France. So when Bonaparte comes back from Egypt in 1799, as still with the aura of success around his head, somewhat tarnished by the disasters in Egypt, he's the man to go for.
After all, he was already noted for his willingness to use force, famously with the remark about the whiff of grape shot and the use of cannon on the Paris streets in 1795 to support the government. And although that did not prove necessary in 1799, he was the crucial muscle.
The overthrow of the Directory was planned for November 1799, the month of Brumaire in the new calendar. But the coup did not pass off as smoothly as the plotters had envisaged. In the chamber of the Council of 500, voices were raised against them. Napoleon himself addressed them and was physically assaulted. He escaped only with the aid of his loyal troops, who purged the chamber of dissenting voices. Those who were left formally approved the replacement of the Directory by the new regime. 3 consuls, Thiers, Ducos, and Napoleon, would now govern France. Thiers saw Napoleon as very much the junior partner. Not surprisingly, Napoleon saw himself differently.
Napoleon cooperated completely in the overthrow, became the leading member of the government, elbowed the 2 others aside, cast them into the dustbin of history, and emerged as the first consul with pretty absolute powers.
Napoleon became first consul on 25th December 1799. He was now de facto ruler of France.
He's able to secure his authority so easily because he's not associated in people's minds with any particular political grouping. He's only associated with military victory. And so he could be all things to all people. And so to the left, he could do things which made him appeal to them. He could do things to the right, like concluding a concordat with the Pope, which would lead to reconciliation with the Catholic Church and all those millions who still supported it in France. He could appeal to pretty well everybody and put it together in a package so that they could all say, well, perhaps we're not getting everything we want, but we're getting enough, including, of course, most importantly, military victory, sealed by the greatest, the invincible Napoleon Bonaparte, to make them continue supporting him.
Within months, the renewed Austrian threat in Italy saw him back on the battlefield. With a force of 24,000 and greatly outnumbered, he faced the Austrians at Marengo. Once again, the gods smiled on him. What could have been a humiliating defeat was turned into a resounding victory. But the Austrian threat was not about to go away. The stage would soon be set for one of the crowning achievements of an already illustrious career. By 1800, Napoleon was securely established as first consul of France. It had been a meteoric rise. He could now shape the country according to his will and put his own stamp on the course of world events. Napoleon's heroes were the likes of Alexander the Great and Charlemagne, visionary men who combined ambition with overwhelming military skill. Now, Napoleon was poised to make a similar contribution to world history. His genius as a soldier and tactician had won him a host of victories, forging in the process an army that was both battle-hardened and fiercely loyal to its young commander.
By 1800, the world was at Napoleon's feet. He was a national hero of unparalleled popularity. He had defeated the Austrians, he had defeated the British, he had opened up Egypt to the world, and now he had taken control of a French government that was almost universally unpopular. He was going to be the savior of France.
There's no return of the royalists to France. The church at this time still is effectively in exile. So many of the values of the revolution are still upheld by Napoleon. And I think he's seen very much as the flag of the revolution still at that time.
Now, Napoleon did not want to be another regime that went out within a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. What he wanted to try and do was to stabilise what he saw as the achievement of the revolution while removing some of what he saw as its excesses.
In December 1799, Napoleon had stated to the French people, "Citizens, the revolution is confined to the principles which commenced it. It is finished." He had drawn a line under the revolution, and it was for him dead.
I think outside France, the response to Napoleon's seizure of power at Brumaire, 1799, was surprisingly favourable. They didn't know what was coming. And remember, they were looking back on a terrible decade of bloodshed inside and outside France. So when Napoleon arrives and announces that the revolution is over, there were a lot of people who wanted to believe him and to believe that stability had returned to France at last.
There had always been a deeply conservative streak in Napoleon's makeup. His love of power outweighed any commitment he may have had to democratic principles. Yet it was not power for its own sake that drove him. It gave him the freedom to influence the future of France and the events of a new century. As first consul, he had that power and immediately set about using it.
He had introduced, or shall we say improved, the secret police under Fouché, and he had a steady flow of information about anybody who could be a danger to his rule. He introduced a fairly rigid censorship, and from some 70 Parisian journals, he reduced them down to about 3 in a very short space of time. Nobody was allowed to publish anything that was in conflict with the principles of the government, his government.
I think Napoleon recognised that he had an opportunity due to the fact that France had become so polarised. Opinion had been so polarised by the Terror especially, that so much had unravelled during the course of the 1790s that there was a tremendous opportunity for someone who stood above parties to take all those unravelled strands and put them back together again. And that can be seen in the fact that he was prepared to use anybody, any talents, no matter where they came from, so long as they served his purpose. He's always in control. But I don't think he bears a grudge against what had gone before, whether it was the Directory or indeed the old regime for that matter.
Wanted the supporters of the old regime, of the Bourbons, to be part of his grand coalition, if you will. He wanted, as much as anything, to have a united France. And for a time, the old regime was actually fairly favorable toward Napoleon, largely because they thought once he brought stability, once he got rid of some of the more radical elements of the revolution, that he, Napoleon, might very well bring back the king. In fact, Louis, the future Louis XVIII, wrote to Napoleon and said, "Ah, well done, my lad. Now why don't you bring me back and all will be well?" And Napoleon wrote back very politely saying, "Sorry, but if you came back, it would be over the bodies of 100,000 dead Frenchmen." I mean, there was no way. Once they realized that Napoleon was not going to be a conduit for the return of the Louis, then they turned on Napoleon. And they made a number of efforts to assassinate Napoleon. The most famous of these efforts, of course, was the so-called infernal machine.
On Christmas Eve, 1800, Napoleon and Josephine were to attend a performance of Haydn's Creation. They travelled in separate coaches. The Royalists had rigged up an infernal machine, a bomb attached to a barrel of gunpowder. It was time to blow up the two coaches together. By sheer good fortune, a gap opened up between the coaches by the time they arrived. Napoleon and Josephine were unscathed, but 52 bystanders were maimed or killed.
That explosion, however, that effort, gave Napoleon an opportunity to eliminate some of his opponents.
There was, of course, a good deal of opposition to the Napoleonic regime after 1799. After all, most French people involved in politics after 1789 had got used to a culture of confrontation, to a culture of conflict, and they couldn't simply change in 1799. And so, of course, a great deal of opposition went on almost as a matter of instinct. There was opposition from the right, I need hardly say, from die-hard Catholics and Royalists. There's opposition from the left, from old-style Jacobins. There's opposition from pretty well every possible quarter.
He always understood that other generals would see him in that position and say, well, gee, that could have been me, you know, and maybe it should have been me, but it wasn't. And Napoleon had to deal with that.
Generals whom he did not trust lost office, lost their positions in the army, or were placed in positions where they were not able to take independent initiatives. And of course, once he was in control of the army and he actively pushed the careers of those people who he could rely on, then he wasn't really concerned greatly about any other possible centre of resistance.
On the left, you had the Jacobins. You had the die-hard revolutionaries who weren't at all sure that a military man as more or less the single leader of France was what they had in mind. Napoleon's desire for order, which was undoubtedly good for the nation, may have raised the hackles of some of the Jacobins who thought that maybe the revolution should come back in a more pure form.
The Jacobins had a secret ally, Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's hated chief of police. He covered up for them and tried to divert Napoleon in the direction of the Royalists. After all, they had been behind the infernal machine.
I don't think the Jacobins were a threat after 1799. They're few in number. They enjoy little support on the streets of Paris, which Napoleon was very careful to keep quiet through a combination of bread and circuses. And although they make a great deal of noise, I don't think they amounted to very much. It helped Napoleon. It helped him to keep the right and the centre-right under control by pretending that they're potentially very dangerous. And if they don't keep Napoleon in power, then it'll be back to the days of the terror and so on and so forth.
130 Republicans were branded terrorists. A death sentence in all but name. Napoleon next turned his attention to the Catholic Church. Stripped of its influence and prestige by the Revolution, it had been rendered virtually powerless. Napoleon decided to reinstate it to a position of influence.
Napoleon's resumption on behalf of France of Catholicism was in a sense a political measure. He saw this as a way to stabilise the situation, and he was correct. To actually follow an anti-church policy, an anti-religious policy, was not a way to enhance the stability of the regime.
He'd seen at first hand, especially in Italy, the force of Catholicism as an ideology and the Catholic Church as an institution in mobilizing popular opposition to the French regime. And he realized that if true domestic stability were to be returned to France, then some kind of arrangement with the Roman Catholic Church would have to be initiated.
At that point in time, Napoleon saw that there could be money to be made by allowing the church back into France, but it was not going to be the old church with its feudal rights and with its property. It was going to be Napoleon's church, like Henry VIII's Church of England. It was Napoleon's Church of France, and it did what he said.
The Pope wanted Napoleon to recognize the church as the dominant religion, but Napoleon wouldn't do that. Instead, he recognized the church as the religion of the overwhelming majority of French citizens. Now, that might seem like just a matter of semantics, but it made a big difference to the people that Napoleon needed for support. Remember, this was not a popular move among the intellectuals, among the Jacobins, the revolutionaries, and among many of the middle class who feared that the next step might be to give back the church lands which they now owned.
So it was that at midnight on 15th July 1801, Napoleon entered into a concordat with Pope Pius VII. To those who still supported the principles of the revolution, this smacked of betrayal. But, as Napoleon had guessed, the official restoration of their religion proved hugely popular with the ordinary people of France, who flocked to the newly opened churches. At Notre Dame on Easter Day, 1802, a mass was held to celebrate the new concordat. Afterwards, Napoleon asked General Delmar whether he thought the service had been a success.
Pretty monkish mummery. The only thing missing were the 1,000,000 men who died to overthrow what you are now setting up again.
There was massive opposition to the Concordat inside France from the left, from the old Jacobins, because the Concordat was the most visible sign that Napoleon was prepared to compromise with the old regime, here with the dominant ideology of the old regime. And so there was a good deal of muttering, and not all of it under their breath, on the part of a number of senior generals, for example, many of whom were Jacobin by orientation.
But even these sentiments did nothing to deflect Napoleon. On 4th of August, 1802, following a landslide victory in a plebiscite, Napoleon was made consul for life. In effect, he was now Emperor of France. The church was now firmly back at the centre of French society. Equally importantly, it was also under the thumb of the new consul. But the restoration of the Catholic Church was only the first area of national life on which Napoleon determined to put his stamp. He saw himself in the tradition of the lawgivers of the ancient world. Introduced in stages, the Code Napoleon would ratify a new legal system in many areas of French life: marriage, education, the jury system. Napoleon had an official explanation for introducing the code. The revolution had bred a spirit of extreme individualism.
It is necessary to throw upon the soil of France a few blocks of granite in order to give a direction to the public spirit.
There are many misconceptions about Napoleon and the Code Napoleon. Napoleon didn't write it himself. A body of legislation had already been started in 1792 and continued from then on. It was in 1792 and 1793 that the old feudal rights were swept away. Napoleon did not sweep them away, as is popularly believed. He merely ensured that they were embodied into his new Code Napoleon, which, as I say, was lying around in the parliamentary system when he came along. What he did, he ramrodded it through in 90 sessions so that it was a coherent and well thought out document which was passed into law. As, what else? The Code Napoleon.
The codification of French laws under the under the consulate, it becomes the civil code, is a very good example of how Napoleon went to work. He got the best people, he organised them, he motivated them, he controlled them, he kept them up to their work, not least by chairing some of the sessions himself. And then he was able to enforce it throughout France through a new centralised bureaucratic system introduced after 1799, based on the prefects.
However much the code purported to benefit the French people as a whole, it was not a move towards democracy and freedom. The only people who really benefited were those Napoleon saw as the social and economic backbone of his new society, the wealthy middle classes who had done so well out of the revolution.
At its root, the French Revolution was a middle-class revolution with middle-class ideals. And Napoleon was also, at his root, a middle-class leader. His goals, his ideals, his policies were geared toward the middle class. Nowhere is this more true than in the field of education. A lot of folks don't realize that Napoleon made great strides to reorganize and reform and improve the French educational system, and that the curriculum ought to be that geared toward preparing people to be members of the middle class, to be government workers, to be military leaders, in short, to be the leadership cadre of France under Napoleon. This is not unlike the system anywhere in the world today. Education is largely a middle-class kind of institution.
In 1802, Napoleon introduced a new honours system, the Legion of Honour. Someone suggested it should be an exclusively military honour. Napoleon disagreed.
If we make a distinction between military and civil honours, we shall be instituting two orders, whereas the nation is one. If we award honours only to soldiers, that will be still worse, for then the nation will cease to exist.
It met with fierce criticism, especially from the left. It was not egalitarian, but among the population at large, it was popular. In all, 30,000 people were decorated.
It was Napoleon who once said, "It is with baubles that men are led." And he is obviously quite right. I mean, you give a guy a star to pin on his coat and he feels 10 feet tall, rather like iron crosses in World War II. The Légion d'honneur was introduced in 4 grades. There was the Chevalier, the officer, the Commander, the Grand Eagle and Grand Officer. And it was open to all those on the field of battle who had achieved something of daring and of note. In that way, it was extremely democratic, and somebody who had won the Légion d'honneur could look to having Field Marshal's baton maybe slipped into his knapsack a day or two afterwards.
It was deeply resented by the old Jacobins as a sign that Napoleon was abandoning the egalitarian ideals of the revolution. And I think it has to be said that that is right. He was creating an elite and singling them out through the award of medals, through the award of a whole hierarchy of titles and uniforms and so on and so forth.
Napoleon may have been a national hero to the French, but he was not a man of the people. He created an even greater distance between himself and the people when he introduced a new nobility, the notables. These were local citizens who, by virtue of their wealth, paid the highest taxes. In return, they were given titles, official positions, and huge official salaries. On Sunday, 2nd December 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Pope Pius VII crowned Napoleon as Emperor of France. Almost as if the revolution had never happened, there was now a single ruler, a state church, an honours system, and a new nobility. But whatever the similarities, it was not the old France. It was a very new entity, ruled by the greatest military genius of the age. He was about to prove the point yet again in spectacular style.
Up until now, that the French army had been made up of a series of armies. So you had the army of Italy, the army of the interior, the army of Germany, and so on. With Napoleon now being the virtual dictator and the supreme military commander, it was important that there was just one army, and that became the Grand Army.
The Grande Armée was an effective army. It was particularly well structured in the development of the corps system, which was essentially a building on the earlier idea of the division. The point about the corps is that it enabled a commander of a corps to contain within that the three independent arms, infantry, cavalry and artillery, so that as an individual corps they could, as it were, cover the bases.
It was a standardised system which has been accepted throughout the world as being the best way to do the job. It's still used today and is unbeatable.
The Grand Army was nothing unique. What Napoleon was he was a great user of other people's ideas, and many of the concepts adopted within the Grand Army had been tried out in the 18th century, and indeed the famous corps system that is spoken about quite often with Napoleon was experimentally tried out first by Moreau in the German theatre. So the idea of a corps was not something that was unique to Napoleon, but it certainly was a good idea, and Napoleon was certainly the first one to admit that if it's a good idea, it should be used.
In 1803, despite an interim period of peace, Britain and France were once more at war. By 1805, Britain had been joined by Austria, Russia and Sweden in the Third Coalition. For the second time, Napoleon began to make plans for the invasion of Britain. Work began on the construction of specially designed vessels. A potential invasion force of over 150,000 troops was to be assembled. As he quickly learned, naval warfare demanded different skills from land warfare.
Napoleon invested a vast amount of money and time in preparing the invasion in the years up to 1803. There is no doubt that he meant to do it. He even had the idea of digging a tunnel under the channel, which was abandoned fairly rapidly. So yes, certainly he intended to do it, but his admirals kept saying to him, you know, we can't just push the boats out and make them do what you want. We have to have the right winds at the right time, and this Napoleon could never comprehend.
Coordinating forces at sea was not like moving units on a battlefield. Obviously, once they were out of sight of land, it was virtually impossible to know where they were, and impossible unless you could get a quicker ship to catch up with them to send them messages. So the coordination of naval forces was very difficult.
One of the problems that Napoleon had was that there was no tradition of naval power in France. They had a navy, certainly. They had some very, very fine fighting ships. They even had a few good commanders, but they didn't have anything at all like the tradition of England.
They had been starved of adequate naval supplies. They couldn't renew the rigging on the boats. The spars were rotten in some cases. The hulls were creaking and leaking. The crews were rebellious under the new spirit of republicanism. Many of the officers had emigrated to save their necks. Many other able officers preferred to go into the merchant marine, which they could happily do, because there at least was some money to be made from capturing foreign prizes.
And then with the imposition of a British blockade by the Royal Navy, the French Navy is cooped up in port, starved of resources, starved of men, and with no training. And so every time the French Navy goes to sea and takes on, or almost every time they go to sea and take on the Royal Navy, they get a bloody nose. And that leads in part to the disaster at the Battle of the Nile, Aboukir Bay in 1798, and then most spectacularly, of course, to Trafalgar.
It was already clear prior to Trafalgar that the situation did not permit an invasion of Britain. Indeed, the French army was already moved into Germany for the Ulm-Austerlitz campaign. So that in fact the fleet which sailed out of Cadiz, which was a French and Spanish fleet, was not intended to invade Britain. It might have been that if that fleet hadn't been destroyed, that subsequently it would have been used in an attempt to cover an invasion after the defeat of Austria. But actually in 1805, by the time of Trafalgar, what Napoleon is most concerned about is to get ships into the Mediterranean to help his campaign in Italy.
With the threat of invasion removed, you can argue that the British no longer had any incentive to come to peace terms with Napoleon. That they had all of the reasons in the world not to come to peace terms. The British were determined to maintain a balance of power on the continent. And to do this, they could not tolerate a France that was too strong. It was not enough just to have naval dominance, because if Napoleon could control all of the continent, he could establish a navy. It might take some time, but he could do it. And then it might be possible for it to have an invasion.
As the Allies made plans of their own in mainland Europe, it must have seemed that the Emperor's attention was diverted elsewhere. But Napoleon's Grande Armée had used its time on the Channel coast to rest and retrain. It could, and would, now be employed to devastating effect. Intelligence reports had reached Napoleon at Boulogne that the coalition planned an ambitious multi-pronged attack. A force made up of British, Russian and Swedish troops would attack Hanover from the north. An Austrian army, under General Mack, would invade Bavaria, supported by a large Russian contingent. Another Austrian army was to strike towards Lombardy from northern Italy, whilst a force under Archduke John of Austria attacked the Tyrol. In the south, a mixed nationality force would launch an assault on Naples. Napoleon, with the Grande Armée at its fighting peak, preempted the coalition's plans by making a swift and decisive move against General Mack in Bavaria. He would remove Mack from the game even before his Russian support had arrived. The Allies, lacking Napoleon's intelligence network, believed wrongly that he would strike first in Italy. They were completely unprepared. Once more, the little corporal descended like a thunderbolt. Once more, the Austrians reeled before him.
It's hard to imagine moving tens and tens of thousands of soldiers all the way from the French coastline into Germany in secrecy. But he, to a very large extent, accomplished that. He also accomplished it in an incredibly short period of time, a mere matter of weeks. Now, the first Austrian force he encountered was at Ulm, under the command of General Mack. General Mack had not a clue that Napoleon was about to encircle him. He almost literally wakes up one morning and discovers that the French have him surrounded.
So as Mack realises that his lines of communication have finally been severed by Napoleon's movements to La Derrière, apart from a fleeing cavalry force under the Archduke Ferdinand, Mack realises the game is up, and with his 25,000 men he surrenders to Napoleon, presenting himself as the unfortunate General Mack. And then Napoleon does take great glee in returning his sword and sending him back to the Emperor of Austria with the news of his own demise.
The manoeuvre around the rear of the Austrian force at Ulm in 1805 was a masterpiece of planning and reflects nothing but glory on the Grande Armée from Napoleon through Berthier and the General Staff all the way down to the guys who were trudging along the roads. It was a masterpiece. Its importance lay not in taking the city of Ulm, which is in a position very difficult to defend anyway, but its importance lay in the capture of the unfortunate General Mack, 25,000 Austrians, the demoralization which pervaded the entire Austrian army after this debacle, and the moral ascendancy that he won over his Austrian and Russian foes when he went forward to fight them again at Austerlitz.
The action against Austria had brought Prussia perilously close to joining the coalition. Napoleon decided on another preemptive strike to weaken the Russians before Prussia could add her weight to that of the Allies. He moved towards the Russians, who were advancing under General Kutuzov. When he learned of the Austrian collapse at Ulm, Kutuzov retreated, keeping one step ahead of the pursuing French. He doubled back across the Danube, cleverly eluding Napoleon, and linking up with the army of General Boxhausen near the town of Olmütz. For once, Napoleon had been outmaneuvered. On 23rd November 1805, at Brunn, 45 kilometers from Olmütz, the Grande Armée rested after their long march from the French coast. They were exhausted and outnumbered, but their finest hour was coming.
Now at this point, Napoleon's position is not nearly as good as it had been earlier. His lines of communication are much longer, his soldiers are much tireder, he sent various portions of his army out into other areas searching for the main body of Austrians and Russians who have now entered the fray. So by the time he gets to Austerlitz, he's got a little bit of a problem. He no longer has the dominant force. He's no longer got the element of surprise, and so he has to resort to some other way of assuring victory.
Napoleon's early skill as an artillery officer had trained him to understand how landscape could be used against an enemy. He surveyed the area around Brunn.
Gentlemen, examine this ground carefully. It is going to be a battlefield.
Dividing his force, he ordered 1/3 of his army under Soult, Murat and Laon to take possession of the village of Austerlitz and the adjacent Pratzen heights. They were to be set up to look like sitting ducks to the numerically superior Russians. Cleverly, Napoleon cultivated the appearance of weakness, receiving Russian envoys and apparently keen to consider peace terms. The Russians didn't know that 22,000 reinforcements would arrive unseen and unsuspected. The French were made to look even weaker when Napoleon withdrew them from the Pratzen heights.
Now you don't normally give up the high ground in a battle if you've already got it, unless you're about to leave. And so he gives up the high ground, and the Russians and the Austrians are astounded, you know. They say, what? Okay, fine. So they immediately, of course, move on to the Pratzen Heights. They're out looking over the whole area. I've stood on the Pratzen Heights, you can see for miles.
The trap was set. The bait had been brilliantly prepared. General Kutuzov's Russian bear needed little urging to take it. The Russians attacked the French right, but were soon hit by a counterattack. This meant the Russians had to take reinforcements from the Pratzen Heights.
Napoleon, with the main body of his army, is shielded below the base of the Pratzen Heights, behind a slight ridge, and a fortuitous thick fog. The Austrians and Russians have no idea he's there. When enough of the Allied forces have descended down after the French right flank, Napoleon gives the order and his forces storm the Pratzen Heights. They realize the mistake up there on the hill, and they try to recall some of their soldiers to defend the Pratzen Heights, but it's too late. Napoleon is able to force his way onto the Pratzen Heights, splitting the armies of his opponents in half. He sends some folks after the retreating Russians. They are able to retreat more or less in decent order, but then he descends on the Austrians. He's now got them sandwiched in between the forces they thought they were pursuing and the forces of Napoleon up on top of the hill, and they are crushed.
As the day wore on, the Russian retreat turned to shambolic nightmare. Harried by the French, the Russians fled south towards the frozen lakes surrounding the heights. Napoleon ordered the French artillery to shoot holes in the ice. In a horrific finale, an insult to those who had fought so bravely, large numbers of men and horses died in the icy waters. When the British Prime Minister Pitt heard the news, he was shattered.
Roll up that map of Europe. It will not be needed these 10 years.
Austerlitz has been seen by some as Napoleon's finest hour. This, of course, is always a tricky issue. I mean, is greatness to be judged, or military greatness to be judged in terms of victory, or sometimes in terms of staving off defeat in very difficult circumstances?
He had demonstrated that he was so far above his opponents. He was so superior to them in planning, in conception, in managing his assets on the battlefield and off it, in judging the character of his enemies, in manipulating their weaknesses and reducing their strengths. Yes, this has got to be his finest.
It epitomised Napoleonic warfare in terms of the men and material used, in terms of his strategy, in terms of tactics on the battlefield. This was it. This was the perfect example of how a battle could be fought, how a battle should be fought. There's no textbook lesson that can be derived from it. It was just something that was perfect.
With the military plans of the coalition in tatters, Austria sued for peace, as her Russian allies retreated through Poland to lick their wounds. For Napoleon, the political map of Europe was waiting to be drawn according to his own designs.
I do not believe that Napoleon ever negotiated a peace. He was incapable of doing so. He negotiated truces when it suited him, but that was only with a view to making war later on terms more advantageous to himself. I don't think that he was psychologically capable of ever making peace with any other power. And the reason for that is that I don't think, although however mad this may sound, that he had aims. That was the secret to success in warfare, according to Clausewitz, was limited aims. And that's what Frederick the Great, for example, had done. He used war as an instrument. When he'd achieved his objective, he stopped. But Napoleon had no objectives. He allowed success in war to generate those objectives, and once they'd been attained, if he was still winning, as of course he was until the end, he went on to some more aims. There was no sense of any clear, coherent aim which would enable him to say, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve, so I can now make peace.
Austerlitz is followed by peace with Austria, and a rather difficult peace in terms of the Austrians, loss of territory, humiliation. But war continues with Russia, and in 1806 is to be widened by the entry of Prussia into the war.
On 7th of August, 1806, Prussia declared war on France and began to mobilize an army of 146,000 men. Within weeks, Russia and Britain had joined her in the Fourth Coalition. Once again, the Grande Armée and its seemingly invincible commander would take to the field.
The politics of 1806 are very complex. The Prussians didn't particularly want to fight Napoleon, but Napoleon pushed and intimidated and bullied them, and they themselves tried to respond to the opportunities of Russia and Britain being at war with France, and in the end Prussia comes into the war. Now, Prussia had not been in the war since 1795. Her military in the meantime had not really been developed, whereas the French military had become much more proficient. And Napoleon takes out, there's no other term that one can use really, Prussia in 1806 in an extraordinarily successful campaign.
On 13th October, Napoleon received news that a large Prussian force had gathered at Jena, a town on the River Saale near Leipzig. A furious battle ensued. The Prussians, under Prince Hohenlohe, fought bravely, but were no match for the numerically superior Grande Armée. By midday, the French had the upper hand. The Prussians, exposed and outnumbered, began to suffer terrible losses. Soon they were in retreat. Once again, Napoleon had emerged victorious. This time, there was a sting in the tail. He had believed that at Jena he had faced the main Prussian force. That night, on returning to his headquarters, he received astounding news.
Way away, about 20 kilometres away to the north, at Auerstedt, Davout, with his First Corps, had in fact blundered into the major part of the Prussian army. Davout was one of Napoleon's most competent corps commanders. His achievements this day were absolutely legendary. With his one corps occupying the vital ground of Hassenhausen, he held the field against almost the entire Prussian army and inflicted extremely heavy casualties against it. Napoleon refused at first to believe that he had only attacked and beaten the smaller part of the Prussian army and that Davout had done the man's job that day. And if you look at the battle honours of the French regiments involved there, you will find that they all get Jena, nobody gets Auerstedt.
This was not at all surprising. I mean, the same could be said of the 1800 campaign of Marengo. This was part of the pattern of military activity, that the person at the top generally claims the credit for their subordinates.
At home, the news of his victory against Prussia did not provoke the same enthusiasm as his exploits at Austerlitz. The French people, unlike their emperor, were war-weary. Conscription had seen a steady stream of young men march off to feed Napoleon's war machine. Soon, they would be marching to Poland. There, the Russians, under General Bennigsen, were waiting for them. On 6 February 1807, in a howling blizzard, the two armies met in one of Napoleon's bloodiest encounters yet. At Eylau, what began as a skirmish ended in a full-scale battle with terrible loss of life.
In many ways, Eylau was comparable to Gettysburg. It was an accident. Both armies were in the neighbourhood of the town of Eylau at this time. The French did not intend to provoke a battle on the evening of the day. The Russians were close up to Eylau but not in possession. All of a sudden, up rolled Imperial headquarters. The Russian patrol, which discovered them, alerted headquarters, and there was an attempt to evict them. This dragged more and more people in from both sides, and it developed into an extremely nasty affair, very close fought, very bloody, an awful lot of dead and wounded.
Eylau was a blood fest. It was a disaster for both sides. It was fought in a snowstorm. It was an old-fashioned slug each other until you both drop kind of affair. At the end, the casualties on both sides were enormous. Did anyone really gain any strategic advantage? You could argue perhaps the French gained a little bit, but nothing that could justify the carnage on the field. It was really one of the least advantageous and least happy battles, if you will, of the entire Napoleonic epic.
Even Napoleon, for whom war was akin to a natural state, was appalled by the carnage at Eylau.
The countryside is covered with dead and wounded. This is not the pleasantest part of war. One suffers, and the soil is oppressed to see so many sufferers.
Rather than press the campaign against the Russians, he withdrew to winter quarters. On the face of it, Eylau was yet another victory in Napoleon's battle roll of honour. But it had been a costly and fortunate victory. On top of that, the Russian threat had not been eliminated. With the end of winter, the campaign resumed. Another French victory followed at the Battle of Friedland. This time the outcome was more decisive. The Russians now sought peace. This came with the signing on 3rd July 1807 of the Treaty of Tilsit. It left Napoleon virtually master of Europe, with an even freer hand to shape the political map of the continent. All this had come at a high price. Blood, misery, and warfare marked the little corporal's rise. The one could not have happened without the other.
I feel myself driven toward an end I do not know. As soon as I have reached it, as soon as I shall become unnecessary, an atom will suffice to shatter me. Till then, not all the forces in mankind can do anything against me.
There's a view of Napoleon held by some that he was a warmonger, that he was only interested in conquest, that he wanted to capture all of Europe for his own benefit, for his own aggrandizement. I don't believe that, and I think history will show clearly that that's not the case. Napoleon saw war as a means to an end.
There are different ways of looking at history. One way generally sees violence as a necessary way to overcome an old order in order to create the new. My own view is that that is a belief rather than an analysis. One could equally argue that people underrate the ability of existing systems to engender change, and that therefore the violence that one sees in episodes such as Napoleon or later the violence of the 20th century revolutions were not ones that one should necessarily see as progressive forces, and in some respects they actually made it harder to advance whatever one might regard as progressive.
By 1808, whatever was driving Napoleon had taken him to the throne of France, a position of unequalled influence in Europe and a further string of military victories. These had been the years of his zenith. More was to follow, but in future, the most powerful man in Europe wouldn't have everything his own way.